All right, history lovers, buckle up. Or rather, don't, because the Byzantine Empire didn't have seatbelts, safety regulations, or honestly any concept of a chill millennium. Tonight, we're diving helmet first into the entire history of the Byzantine Empire, from Rome's heir to final fall, which is a fancy way of saying a 1,000-year soap opera where everyone's related, everyone's plotting murder, and the office is literally on fire. Again. That's right. We're talking about an empire so extra, so melodramatic, so committed to the bit that they kept calling themselves Romans for 11 centuries after Rome ghosted them harder than your ex after reading your 3 a.m. You up? Text. Tonight you're not just a viewer. You're a time-traveling intern at Byzantine HQ where the dress code is purple silk. The HR policy is survive or get blinded. And every Tuesday someone tries to overthrow the government during chariot races. Your qualifications: a pulse and an unhealthy tolerance for theological arguments that somehow end in civil war. Your job duties: watch emperors named Constantine fight other emperors named Constantine, while everyone argues whether Jesus had one nature or two. And yes, people literally died over this. We'll stroll through Constantinople where the architecture is magnificent, the walls are impregnable, and the political intrigue is so thick you could spread it on toast. We'll witness Greek fire melting enemy fleets, monks passionately destroying religious art, and crusaders, you know, fellow Christians, deciding the best way to help was looting everything not bolted down. Spoiler alert, they unbolted stuff. But don't worry, the heaviest thing you'll lift tonight is your phone to hit subscribe, because if 30,000 people can die in the hippodrome over chariot racing team colors, surely you can tap a button. Drop a comment with your favorite Byzantine emperor name. Spoiler, half of them are either Constantine or someone who murdered a Constantine. Dim those lights, grab your metaphorical imperial purple, and prepare for 1,000 years of wait. They survived that. Sweet dreams, honorary Byzantine citizen. The empire may have fallen, but this documentary, immortal. The year is 330 AD. The ancient world stands at a crossroads. In the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire, on a peninsula where Europe meets Asia, a new capital rises from the shores of the Bosphorus. Emperor Constantine, the Great, gazes upon the city that will bear his name, Constantinople. He cannot know that this moment marks not an ending, but a beginning. The birth of an empire that will endure for over 1,000 years, outlasting Rome itself by nearly a millennium. But to understand Byzantium, we must first understand what came before. We must journey back to the twilight of Rome's glory, to an empire stretched beyond its limits, fracturing under the weight of its own magnificence. The 3rd century had been catastrophic for Rome. Barbarian invasions from the north, Persian aggression in the east, economic collapse, political chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome witnessed 50 emperors, most dying violent deaths. The empire that had brought law and order to the Mediterranean world seemed poised to crumble into oblivion. The Pax Romana, that golden age of peace and prosperity, had given way to an era of crisis and uncertainty. Then came Diocletian, a soldier emperor who understood that Rome had grown too vast for one man to rule. In 285 AD, he made a decision that would reshape history. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor. The Tetrarchy, he called it, the rule of 4, 2 senior emperors, 2 junior Caesars, sharing the burden of an empire that spanned from Britannia to the deserts of Mesopotamia. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem. The eastern capital was established at Nicomedia, in what is now Turkey. The seeds of Byzantine civilization had been planted, but Diocletian's system was fragile. It depended on cooperation, on the willingness of ambitious men to share power. Such arrangements rarely survive their architects. When Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, the first Roman emperor to retire voluntarily, the tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. Rival claimants battled for supremacy across the empire's vast territories. From this chaos emerged Constantine, son of a Western Caesar, a man who would change the world in ways even he could scarcely imagine. Constantine's rise was neither inevitable nor peaceful. He fought his way to power through a series of brutal civil wars. At the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, he defeated his rival Maxentius in a battle that would echo through the centuries. Legend tells us that before the battle, Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, bearing the words in this sign, "Conquer." Whether divine revelation or political calculation, Constantine embraced Christianity, a faith that had been persecuted for centuries, driven underground, its followers martyred in Roman arenas for the entertainment of crowds. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christianity, once the religion of slaves and outcasts, began its transformation into the faith of emperors. But Constantine's genius lay not merely in religious policy. He understood geography. He understood that the real wealth of the Roman world lay in the east, in Egypt's grain fields, in Syria's trade routes, in Anatolia's prosperous cities. The West was already dying, overrun by Germanic tribes, its economy in ruins. The future belonged to the East, and so Constantine chose Byzantium, an ancient Greek colony founded nearly 1,000 years earlier, perched on a peninsula where the Sea of Marmara meets the Bosphorus Strait. It was a location of almost miraculous strategic perfection. A natural harbor, walls on 3 sides protected by water, control over the only sea route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. From this city, an emperor could defend against threats from both Europe and Asia. From this city, an emperor could command the richest provinces of the ancient world. For 6 years, Constantine transformed Byzantium into a capital worthy of empire. He brought architects and artists from across the Roman world. He built churches, forums, palaces, and aqueducts. He adorned the city with statues and treasures plundered from ancient temples. On May 11, 330 AD, he dedicated the city formally. Nova Roma, New Rome, though the world would know it as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The new capital symbolized a new beginning. Where Rome had been pagan, Constantinople would be Christian. Where Rome looked west to the barbarian frontiers, Constantinople looked east to the wealthy civilizations of Persia and beyond. The empire had not divided. Officially, it remained one, ruled by one law, one citizenship. But in practice, 2 distinct civilizations had begun to emerge: the Latin West and the Greek East, the dying and the living. Constantine died in 337 AD, baptized on his deathbed, his empire divided among his 3 sons. What followed was predictable: more civil war, more bloodshed, as brothers fought for supremacy. By 353 AD, only one survived, Constantius II, who ruled an empire temporarily reunited but fundamentally unstable. The old Roman system of adoptive succession, which had produced the 5 good emperors, had given way to dynastic chaos. Emperors were made and unmade by the army. Loyalty could be bought with gold. Stability was an illusion. Yet through these turbulent decades, Constantinople grew in wealth and magnificence. The city attracted scholars, merchants, and artisans. Greek culture, which Rome had conquered but never truly replaced, reasserted itself. The eastern provinces had always been more Greek than Roman, their cities ancient when Rome was still a village on the Tiber. Now, in Constantinople, Hellenic civilization found a new champion dressed in Roman imperial purple. The late 4th century brought both crisis and transformation. Julian the Apostate, Constantine's nephew, briefly attempted to restore paganism, a doomed effort that died with him on a Persian battlefield in 363 AD. The empire lurched back toward Christianity, but now theological disputes threatened to tear it apart. What was the nature of Christ? Was he fully divine, fully human, or both? These questions, which might seem abstract to modern minds, stirred passions as fierce as any political conflict. Entire cities rioted over doctrinal differences. Bishops wielded power that rivaled emperors. Then came the disaster that would reshape the ancient world forever. In 378 AD, at Adrianople, a Roman army was annihilated by the Goths, a Germanic people fleeing westward from the Huns. Emperor Valens died on the battlefield, his body never found. It was Rome's worst military defeat since Cannae, over 500 years earlier. The myth of Roman invincibility lay shattered in the Thracian dust. Theodosius the Great rose to meet this crisis. He was the last emperor to rule both East and West, and he understood what many Romans refused to accept. The barbarians could not be defeated. They could only be managed. He settled Gothic foederati within the empire as allies, giving them land in exchange for military service. He made Christianity the official state religion, closing the pagan temples that had stood for 1,000 years. In 395 AD, upon his death, he divided the empire permanently between his 2 sons. Arcadius received the east, Honorius the west. They would never be reunited. The Western Empire entered its death spiral. Rome was sacked by Visigoths in 410 AD, by Vandals in 455 AD. Barbarian kingdoms carved up Gaul, Hispania, and Africa. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, named after Rome's founder and its first emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. But in Constantinople, the empire endured. The Eastern emperors never accepted the loss of the West. They continued to style themselves as Roman emperors, rulers of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia, from the Adriatic to the Euphrates. They spoke Greek, not Latin. They worshipped in ornate churches, not classical temples. But they were Roman in law, in administration, in the belief that they were the inheritors of an eternal empire ordained by God himself. The 5th century tested this belief. Constantinople faced threats from all directions. Hunnic invasions ravaged the Balkans. Persian wars drained the treasury. Religious controversies threatened to split the church. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD attempted to resolve disputes about Christ's nature, but succeeded only in alienating the monophysite Christians of Egypt and Syria, who rejected the council's decisions. The empire's theological unity which Constantine had sought to create, remained elusive. Yet Constantinople not only survived but flourished. Its walls, built and expanded by Theodosius Roman II, proved impregnable. The Theodosian walls stretched for miles, triple-layered fortifications that would protect the city for 1,000 years. Attila, the Hun, who had ravaged Europe, looked upon these walls and turned away. The city's wealth continued to grow, fed by taxes from Egypt's grain and the lucrative trade routes that passed through its harbors. While Rome faded into memory, Constantinople blazed with light. The year 527 AD brought to power an emperor who would transform Byzantium from a surviving remnant of Rome into something new and glorious. Justinian I ascended the throne with dreams of glory, a peasant son from the Balkans who had risen through talent and ambition. Beside him stood Theodora, his wife, a former actress from the Hippodrome, a woman of humble origins who would prove herself one of the most formidable empresses in history. Justinian looked west and saw the lost provinces of the Roman Empire ruled by barbarian kings. He saw Roman citizens living under Germanic law, Roman cities fallen into decay, and he refused to accept it. He dreamed of restoration, of reconquest, of making the Mediterranean once again a Roman lake. It was an impossible dream. But Justinian would nearly achieve it. First, he needed peace in the east. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival, had to be neutralized. In 532 AD, Justinian negotiated the eternal peace with the Persian Shah Khosrow I, paying a heavy tribute but securing his eastern frontier. Now he could turn his attention westward. But before he could launch his wars of reconquest, Constantinople itself nearly fell, not to foreign enemies, but to its own citizens. The Nika riots of 532 AD began as a dispute between chariot racing factions in the Hippodrome. The Blues and the Greens, rival fan clubs that had evolved into political and paramilitary organizations, united against Justinian's government. For 5 days, the city burned. Rioters proclaimed a new emperor. Half of Constantinople lay in ruins, including the great church of Hagia Sophia. Justinian prepared to flee. It was Theodora who saved the empire. As Justinian and his advisors contemplated escape, she rose and spoke words that would echo through history. Purple makes a fine burial shroud. An emperor who fled would lose everything. Better to die wearing the imperial purple. Shamed into courage, Justinian ordered his generals Belisarius and Narses to act. They trapped the rioters in the Hippodrome and slaughtered them. 30,000 died. Justinian's throne was secure, purchased in blood. From catastrophe came opportunity. With much of Constantinople in ruins, Justinian could rebuild according to his vision of imperial grandeur. He commissioned the construction of a new Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, that would surpass anything the ancient world had produced. The architects Anthemius and Isidore created a miracle in stone and light. The great dome, seemingly floating on shafts of sunlight streaming through windows at its base, soared higher than any structure in the Western world. When Justinian entered the completed church in 537 AD, he supposedly whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." It was no idle boast. Hagia Sophia stood as the greatest church in Christendom for 900 years, a testament to Byzantine engineering and artistry that still inspires awe today. But Justinian's true obsession lay with reconquest. In 533 AD, he sent Belisarius with a small fleet to North Africa, where the Vandal kingdom had ruled for a century. Against all odds, Belisarius destroyed the Vandal army in 2 swift battles. North Africa returned to Roman control. Encouraged by this success, Justinian turned his eyes to Italy. The Italian campaign would prove far more difficult. The Ostrogothic kingdom, which ruled the Italian peninsula, fought desperately to maintain its independence. Belisarius landed in Sicily in 535 AD and began a war that would devastate the peninsula for nearly 2 decades. Rome itself changed hands multiple times. Ancient aqueducts were destroyed. Cities were depopulated. The Italian countryside became a wasteland. By the time Byzantine forces achieved final victory in 554 AD, Italy lay in ruins, economically shattered, a prize hardly worth the winning. Yet Justinian had achieved what seemed impossible. He had recovered North Africa, Italy, and even part of southern Spain. The Mediterranean was once again encircled by territories acknowledging a Roman emperor. It was the last time this would ever be true. The empire had reached its greatest territorial extent since the fall of the West. On maps, it looked impressive. In reality, Justinian had overextended. The reconquered territories drained resources rather than adding to imperial wealth. The wars had emptied the treasury. And the eastern frontiers, neglected during these western campaigns, grew increasingly unstable. Nature itself seemed to turn against Justinian's ambitions. In 541 AD, plague arrived in Constantinople aboard merchant ships from Egypt. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, was probably the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, the same disease that would later devastate Europe as the Black Death. For 4 months, it ravaged the capital. At its height, 5,000 people died every day. Bodies piled up in the streets, rotted in abandoned houses. Eventually, they were simply thrown into the sea or piled into the towers of city fortifications. Justinian himself fell ill, but recovered. Perhaps 1/3 of Constantinople's population perished. The plague spread throughout the empire, carried along trade routes, striking cities and countryside alike. The demographic catastrophe weakened Byzantium at the moment of its greatest territorial extent. The army struggled to find recruits. Tax revenues plummeted. The ambitious plans for restored Roman glory confronted the grim reality of mass death and economic contraction. And yet, the empire endured. Constantinople recovered. Life continued. The plague eventually subsided, though it would return in periodic waves for the next 2 centuries. Despite everything, Justinian's reign represented a golden age of Byzantine civilization. Beyond military campaigns, he undertook the systematic codification of Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, compiled and organized 1,000 years of Roman legal tradition. This massive work became the foundation of legal systems throughout Europe and influenced jurisprudence for centuries to come. Justinian's legal code represented one of Rome's greatest gifts to posterity, the principle that society should be governed by written law applied equally to all citizens. Justinian also presided over a flowering of architecture and art. Throughout his empire, new churches rose, decorated with magnificent mosaics that combined classical Greco-Roman techniques with Christian iconography and Eastern splendor. Byzantine art developed its distinctive style: flattened perspective, stylized figures, extensive use of gold, an emphasis on divine majesty rather than human realism. This was not a decline from classical naturalism, but a deliberate choice, an art form that sought to represent spiritual truths rather than physical reality. When Justinian died in 565 AD, he left an empire that looked magnificent but was fundamentally weakened. The treasury was empty. The plague had decimated the population. The reconquered western territories were unstable and expensive to maintain. The Sassanid Persians had resumed their attacks on the eastern frontier. Worse, new threats were emerging. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes pressed southward. In Arabia, forces were stirring that would soon shake the world. Justinian's successors struggled to maintain his legacy. Justin Roman II, his nephew, suffered a mental breakdown under the pressure of imperial responsibilities. Tiberius Roman II and Maurice tried to hold the frontiers, but the empire was under attack from all sides. Maurice was a capable ruler who fought tirelessly to defend Byzantine territory, but in 602 AD, his own army mutinied. He was overthrown and executed along with his sons by a centurion named Phocas, a brutal tyrant whose reign brought the empire to the edge of catastrophe. Phocas's misrule gave the Persians their opportunity. Under Shah Khosrow Roman II, the Sassanid Empire launched an all-out assault on Byzantine territory. One by one, the eastern provinces fell. Syria in 611 AD. Egypt in 619 AD. Persian armies reached the Bosphorus itself, camping within sight of Constantinople's walls. The Avars, a nomadic people, besieged the city from the European side. The empire seemed doomed, its territories reduced to little more than Constantinople and scattered holdings in Anatolia. In 610 AD, salvation arrived in the form of Heraclius, the son of the Exarch of Carthage, who sailed to Constantinople, overthrew Phocas, and assumed the purple. He inherited an empire in terminal crisis. The treasury was empty. The Persians occupied the empire's wealthiest provinces. The Avars threatened from the north. Many advised negotiation, even surrender. Heraclius himself briefly considered abandoning Constantinople and relocating the capital to Carthage, but the church rallied the population. The patriarch Sergius convinced Heraclius to stay and fight, even melting down church treasure to pay the army. For years, Heraclius reorganized what remained of Byzantine territory, reforming the administration and military. He created the theme system, dividing the empire into military districts where soldier farmers held land in exchange for military service. This system would become the foundation of Byzantine military organization for centuries. In 622 AD, Heraclius went on the offensive. He took the risky decision to bypass the Persian armies occupying the eastern provinces and strike directly into the heart of Persian territory. For 6 years, he campaigned deep in enemy land, a Byzantine Alexander seeking to defeat the ancient enemy once and for all. In 627 AD, at the Battle of Nineveh, Heraclius destroyed the main Persian army. The following year, he marched on the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. The Sassanid Empire collapsed into civil war. Khosrow Roman II was overthrown and murdered by his own son. The victory was complete. The Persians sued for peace, returning all conquered Byzantine territory. In 629 AD, Heraclius made a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, personally returning the true cross, which the Persians had captured years earlier. It seemed a miracle. The empire had been saved from certain destruction. Heraclius was hailed as a new Constantine, the emperor who had preserved Christian civilization. Poets composed hymns in his honor. The church proclaimed him God's chosen instrument, but the celebrations were premature. The long wars had exhausted both the Byzantine and Persian empires. Their armies were depleted, their treasuries empty, their populations decimated by decades of warfare and repeated plague outbreaks. And in the deserts of Arabia, a new power had emerged that would change the world forever. In 632 AD, the Prophet Mehmed died in Medina, having unified the Arab tribes under the banner of Islam. His successors, the caliphs, looked beyond Arabia for conquest and converts. They found two exhausted empires, locked in mutual destruction, their frontier provinces weakly defended. In 634 AD, Arab armies burst out of the desert, moving with a speed and ferocity that stunned the civilized world. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD sealed the fate of Byzantine Syria. A massive Byzantine army, recalled from across the empire, was annihilated by a smaller but more mobile Arab force. Syria fell. Then came the catastrophe that Heraclius could not bear to witness, the loss of Egypt. Alexandria, the great city of learning, surrendered in 642 AD. Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, the source of Constantinople's grain, was gone. Heraclius, heartbroken, died that same year, having witnessed his lifetime of achievement undone in less than a decade. The Arab conquests continued with terrifying momentum. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival, was completely destroyed by 651 AD, absorbed entirely into the rapidly expanding caliphate. North Africa, so laboriously reconquered by Justinian, fell to the Arabs by 698 AD. The Byzantines clung to Anatolia, but even here, Arab raiding parties penetrated deep into the heartland. Constantinople itself was besieged by Arab forces in 674–678 AD, and again in 717–718 AD. The second siege of Constantinople was the turning point. The Arab Caliphate, now under the Umayyad dynasty, had expanded from Spain to Central Asia. They controlled more territory than Rome at its height. Only Constantinople blocked their path into Europe. For a year, Arab armies and fleets surrounded the city, determined to capture the great Christian capital. But the walls held. Byzantine defenders used a devastating new weapon, Greek fire, a liquid incendiary that burned even on water, destroying the Arab fleet. The winter was harsh. Disease ravaged the besiegers. Emperor Leo III the Isaurian, a brilliant general who had seized the throne just before the siege, coordinated a tenacious defense. In 718 AD, the Arabs withdrew, having lost tens of thousands of men. It was their first major defeat. The myth of Islamic invincibility was shattered. Constantinople had saved Christian Europe, though few in the West acknowledged it. The Byzantines had fought alone, without aid from the Germanic kingdoms that now ruled the former Western Empire. That battle would never be forgotten in Constantinople. They had stood between civilization and conquest, and they had held. But the losses were staggering. The Byzantine Empire had been reduced to less than half its former size. Gone were the wealthy provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. Gone was most of North Africa. The empire now consisted primarily of Anatolia, the Balkans, and parts of Italy. The loss of Egypt cut off the grain supply that had fed Constantinople for centuries. The empire had to reorganize itself economically and militarily to survive in this new, hostile world. The 8th century became the age of the Iconoclast controversy, a religious dispute that tore Byzantine society apart for over a century. In 726 AD, Emperor Leo III issued an edict against the veneration of icons, religious images of Christ, Mary, and the saints. Iconoclasm, as the movement was called, had multiple motivations. Some argued that icons violated the biblical prohibition against graven images. Others believed that military defeats were God's punishment for idolatry. Leo and his successors may also have sought to assert imperial authority over the increasingly powerful church and monasteries. The controversy split the empire. In the capital and Anatolia, imperial iconoclasm was generally enforced. Precious icons were destroyed. Mosaics were plastered over. Artists and monks who resisted were persecuted. But in the provinces, especially in Greece and Italy, opposition was fierce. The veneration of icons was deeply embedded in popular piety. Monks and nuns, for whom icons were essential to spiritual life, resisted violently. The popes in Rome condemned iconoclasm, further widening the growing divide between Eastern and Western Christianity. The controversy raged through the reigns of multiple emperors. Armies fought in the streets of Constantinople between iconoclasts and iconodules, those who venerated icons. The dispute became entangled with politics, as rival factions used religious differences to justify rebellion and civil war. In 787 AD, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, convened by Empress Irene, restored icon veneration. But the controversy erupted again under subsequent emperors, not ending definitively until 843 AD, when Empress Theodora, another female ruler, permanently restored the icons. The first Sunday of Lent was designated the Feast of Orthodoxy, celebrating the restoration of true faith, a feast still observed in Orthodox churches today. The iconoclast controversy had profound consequences. It deepened the theological and cultural divide between the Greek East and Latin West. The popes who had opposed iconoclasm increasingly looked to the Frankish kings for protection rather than to the Byzantine emperors. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as Roman emperor in the West. The Byzantines were outraged. There could be only one Roman Empire, one Roman emperor, and he resided in Constantinople. Charlemagne's coronation represented both a challenge to Byzantine supremacy and a recognition that the Christian world had irreversibly split. Yet even as the empire struggled with internal religious conflict and external threats, Byzantine culture flourished. The 8th and 9th centuries saw remarkable achievements in art, literature, and learning. Byzantine scholars preserved classical Greek philosophy and literature that would otherwise have been lost. The works of Plato and Aristotle, Homer and Sophocles, Euclid and Ptolemy survived in Byzantine manuscripts, later transmitted to the Islamic world and eventually to Western Europe, fueling the Renaissance centuries later. The 9th century brought a new dynasty and a new era of expansion. In 867 AD, Basil I, a peasant from Macedonia who had risen through the ranks to become co-emperor, murdered his predecessor and founded the Macedonian dynasty. Despite its bloody beginning, this dynasty would rule for nearly 200 years and preside over Byzantium's last great age of power and prosperity. Under the Macedonian emperors, Byzantium went on the offensive. For 2 centuries, the empire had been on the defensive, struggling to survive against Arab invasions. Now, with the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented into competing dynasties, Byzantium struck back. Generals like Basil I and his successors pushed into Syria, reconquering Antioch in 969 AD, one of the great cities of early Christianity, lost to the Arabs 3 centuries earlier. In the Balkans, Byzantine missionaries competed with the West for the souls of Slavic converts. Saints Cyril and Methodius, Byzantine monks, created the Cyrillic alphabet to translate the Bible into Slavic languages. Their missionary efforts brought Bulgaria, Serbia, and eventually Russia into the Orthodox Christian world, extending Byzantine cultural and religious influence far beyond the empire's political borders. To this day, Orthodox Christianity remains the dominant faith across Eastern Europe and Russia, a legacy of Byzantine evangelism. The reign of Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, marked the apex of Byzantine military power. Ascending the throne in 976 AD, he spent the first years of his reign crushing internal revolts from powerful aristocratic families who sought to dominate the throne. Once secure, he turned his formidable military talents against the Bulgarian Empire, which had threatened Byzantine territory for generations. For decades, Basil campaigned in the Balkans with ruthless efficiency. In 1014 AD, after the Battle of Claudion, he captured 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. In an act of calculated terror, he blinded 99 out of every 100 prisoners, leaving the 100th man with one eye to guide his comrades home. When the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel saw his mutilated army returning, he reportedly died of shock. By 1018 AD, Bulgaria was completely annexed, and the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest extent since Justinian. Under Basil II and his immediate successors, Byzantium seemed invincible once more. The empire stretched from southern Italy to the borders of Armenia, from the Danube to Syria. Constantinople was the largest, wealthiest city in the Christian world, with a population approaching 500,000. Its markets overflowed with goods from across the known world: silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, wine from Greece, wheat from Thrace. Byzantine gold coins, the namasma or solidus, were the international currency of trade, valued for their purity and stability from Britain to Persia. Byzantine culture reached new heights of sophistication. The imperial court developed elaborate ceremonials, described in minute detail in the Book of Ceremonies compiled by Constantine, the 7th Porphyrogenitos. Every gesture, every piece of clothing, every ritual had meaning, designed to demonstrate the emperor's position as God's representative on earth. Foreign ambassadors were awed and intimidated by the choreographed majesty of imperial audiences, where mechanical lions roared, mechanical birds sang, and the emperor sat upon a throne that could rise magically toward the ceiling. But beneath this magnificent facade, fundamental weaknesses were developing. The military success of Basil Roman II was not matched by institutional reform. The theme system, which had provided reliable soldiers for centuries, was breaking down. Powerful aristocratic families accumulated vast estates, reducing free peasants to dependency and undermining the military recruitment system. The army increasingly relied on foreign mercenaries, Normans, Russians, Armenians, and others, rather than native soldiers. These mercenaries fought effectively, but felt no loyalty to the empire beyond their pay. The bureaucracy, once efficient and meritocratic, became corrupt and rigid. Positions were bought and sold. Competence mattered less than connections. The great families of the military aristocracy and the civil bureaucracy competed for control of the state, pursuing their own interests rather than the empire's welfare. Emperors after Basil Roman II were often weak rulers, dominated by court factions, more interested in theological disputes than military preparedness. And then came the catastrophe of Manzikert. In 1071 AD, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a massive Byzantine army into eastern Anatolia to confront the Seljuk Turks, a new nomadic people from Central Asia who had converted to Islam and were raiding Byzantine territory. At Manzikert, everything went wrong. Byzantine forces were poorly coordinated. Mercenary contingents, especially the Normans, betrayed or abandoned the emperor at critical moments. The battle became a disaster. Romanos himself was captured, an unprecedented humiliation. Though the Seljuk Sultan treated his captive with courtesy and released him, the damage was irreversible. The Battle of Manzikert shattered Byzantine power in Anatolia. With the emperor captured and the army destroyed, Anatolia lay open to Turkish invasion. Over the following decades, Turkish nomads and warriors flooded into the peninsula, settling the land, establishing emirates, gradually transforming the heartland of the Byzantine Empire from a Christian, Greek-speaking region into a Muslim, Turkish one. Refugees flooded into Constantinople, bringing tales of devastation and forced conversion. At the same moment, Byzantium faced disaster in the west. Norman adventurers who had been employed as mercenaries conquered Byzantine southern Italy, capturing Bari, the last Byzantine stronghold, in 1071 AD, the same year as Manzikert. In a single year, the empire lost control of both Anatolia and Italy, the twin pillars of Byzantine power. The empire seemed to be collapsing as rapidly as it had risen. Civil wars erupted as rival generals fought for the throne. The Seljuk Turks advanced to within 100 miles of Constantinople. The economy contracted as tax-producing territories were lost. The numisma, stable for 7 centuries, was debased. Inflation ravaged the economy. Military recruitment became increasingly difficult. Into this crisis stepped Alexios I Komnenos, who seized the throne in 1081 AD and founded a new dynasty. Alexios was a brilliant diplomat and administrator, though only a competent general. He recognized that Byzantium could no longer stand alone. The empire needed allies. He negotiated carefully with the Venetians, granting them extensive trading privileges in exchange for naval support. He played off various enemies against each other, Normans against Turks, Turkish emirates against each other, nomadic Pechenegs against Seljuks. Most fatefully, Alexios appealed to Pope Urban II for military assistance against the Seljuk Turks. He requested a manageable force of Western mercenaries to help reconquer lost Anatolian territories. What he got instead shocked him. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban preached the First Crusade, calling on Western knights to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Tens of thousands of warriors, many little better than armed mobs, marched east toward Constantinople. The arrival of the First Crusade in 1096-1097 AD was traumatic for the Byzantines. These Western Crusaders were supposed to be co-religionists, fellow Christians coming to aid the empire. Instead, they appeared as barely controlled barbarians, pillaging the countryside, threatening Constantinople itself, showing contempt for Byzantine civilization. Their leaders refused to acknowledge the emperor's authority, pursuing their own ambitions. Yet Alexios skillfully managed the crisis, extracting oaths of fealty from the Crusade leaders, using them to reconquer western Anatolia before they continued south to Syria and Palestine. The Crusader states established in Syria and Palestine created a complex new geopolitical situation. Officially, they were Byzantine subjects or allies. In practice, they were independent and often hostile to Constantinople. They competed with Byzantium for influence over Antioch and other reconquered cities. Western knights saw Byzantines as effete and treacherous. Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as crude barbarians. The cultural and religious divide between Eastern and Western Christianity, long growing, widened further. The 12th century brought both recovery and new dangers. Under the Komnenian emperors, Alexios, his son John II, and his grandson Manuel I, the empire stabilized. Anatolia was partially recovered, though the interior remained under Turkish control. The Balkans were secured. Constantinople remained the greatest city in Europe, its population and wealth unmatched. Byzantine art and culture continued to flourish, producing magnificent mosaics and illuminated manuscripts. Manuel I Komnenos, who reigned from 1143 to 1180 AD, was the last Byzantine emperor to pursue an aggressive expansionist policy. He dreamed of reuniting the Roman Empire, launching campaigns in Italy against the Normans, intervening in Hungarian affairs, attempting to control the Crusader states. He hosted elaborate tournaments in the Western style, married a Western princess, and surrounded himself with Latin advisors. But his ambitions exceeded his resources. His Italian campaigns failed. His army was destroyed by the Seljuk Turks at Myriokephalon in 1176 AD, a defeat that confirmed Turkish dominance in central Anatolia. When Manuel died in 1180 AD, the empire was financially exhausted and militarily overextended. What followed was political chaos. Manuel's young son Alexios II was overthrown and murdered. Usurpers and counter-usurpers battled for power. The aristocracy fragmented into competing factions. Provincial governors declared independence. The empire's weaknesses were exposed for all to see. And in Western Europe, powerful kingdoms, the Normans, the Hohenstaufen German emperors, and the Italian maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, saw opportunity in Byzantine weakness. The catastrophe came in 1204 AD. The Fourth Crusade, originally intended to attack Egypt, was diverted to Constantinople through a complex series of political manipulations involving Venetian commercial interests and Byzantine succession disputes. On April 12, 1204 AD, Crusader armies breached Constantinople's walls for the first time in the city's history. What followed was 3 days of systematic destruction and looting. The Crusaders sacked Constantinople with a thoroughness that shocked even hardened medieval warriors. Churches were desecrated. Libraries were burned. Priceless works of art were destroyed or shipped west. Ancient bronze statues were melted down for coinage. Nuns were raped. Priests were murdered at their altars. The city that had stood for nearly 900 years as the bulwark of Christian civilization was ravaged by Christian soldiers. The devastation was beyond comprehension. The great palace, home to emperors for centuries, was stripped of its treasures. The hippodrome's ancient monuments were smashed or carried away. Hagia Sophia, the great church that had stood as Christianity's crown jewel, was looted. Crusaders broke open the altar, stealing the precious metals. They brought horses and mules into the sanctuary to carry away the plunder. A prostitute sat upon the patriarch's throne, singing bawdy songs and dancing for the amusement of drunken soldiers. The Byzantine historian Nyctas Choniates, who witnessed the sack, wrote with bitter eloquence of the destruction. Even the Saracens are merciful and kind compared to these men who bear the cross of Christ on their shoulders. The Fourth Crusade accomplished what centuries of Persian, Arab, and Turkish invasions had failed to do. It broke the Byzantine Empire. The psychological wound never healed. Byzantines never forgot that Christian warriors from the West had done more damage to Constantinople than all the empire's Muslim enemies combined. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a feudal kingdom imposed on Byzantine territory. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor in Hagia Sophia. Byzantine lands were divided among Crusader lords according to Western feudal custom. Venice claimed its share, securing strategic ports and islands throughout the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. The Venetians had achieved their commercial objectives. Byzantium, their greatest trade rival, was destroyed, but Byzantine civilization did not die. In the chaos of 1204 AD, 3 Byzantine successor states emerged from the wreckage. In western Anatolia, Theodora Lascaris established the Empire of Nicaea, maintaining Byzantine imperial traditions and claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. In Epirus, on the Adriatic coast, another Byzantine state formed. And in the Crimea, the Empire of Trebizond was established, clinging to the Black Sea coast, a small remnant of Byzantine glory that would somehow survive until 1461 AD, outlasting Constantinople itself by 8 years. The Empire of Nicaea became the primary Byzantine state in exile. Its emperors never stopped planning to recapture Constantinople. They maintained the full imperial bureaucracy, the Orthodox Patriarchate, the cultural and intellectual traditions of Byzantium. In many ways, Nicaea proved that Byzantine identity was not tied to Constantinople itself, but to a shared culture, faith, and historical memory. The exiled court at Nicaea preserved classical learning, theological scholarship, and artistic traditions, waiting for the day when Constantinople could be reclaimed. That day came in 1261 AD. The Latin Empire had proven weak and unstable, unable to defend its territories or command loyalty from its subjects. The Greek population of Constantinople never accepted Latin rule. They aided Byzantine forces whenever possible. In July 1261 AD, General Alexios Strategopoulos, with a small force, found Constantinople's defenses undermanned. Most of the Latin garrison was away on campaign. He entered the city almost unopposed. The Latin Emperor Baldwin II fled. On August 15, 1261 AD, Michael VIII Palaeologos entered Constantinople in triumph, the first Byzantine emperor to rule from the ancient capital in 57 years. But the Constantinople that Michael entered was a shadow of its former magnificence. Whole districts lay in ruins. The population had declined from perhaps 400,000 to fewer than 50,000. The great palace was uninhabitable, so damaged that the emperors moved to the palace of Blasharny. Churches stood empty, stripped of their treasures. The harbor facilities had deteriorated. The great aqueducts that brought water to the city had fallen into disrepair. Grass grew in the streets of districts that had once bustled with commerce and life. The restored Byzantine Empire was a weakened, diminished state. It controlled only Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, parts of Thrace, and territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. Much of what had been Byzantine territory was now in the hands of independent Greek despots, Latin lords, Serbian kingdoms, and Turkish emirates. The empire's revenue base had collapsed. Where once Byzantine emperors commanded the resources of wealthy provinces from Egypt to the Balkans, now they struggled to pay a few thousand soldiers. Michael VIII spent his reign desperately trying to defend Constantinople against threats from all directions. Charles of Anjou, brother of the French king, planned to recapture Constantinople for the Latins. Michael used every tool of Byzantine diplomacy: bribes, subsidies to Charles's enemies, alliance with Genoa against Venice, and ultimately the promise of church union with Rome. At the Council of Lyon in 1274 AD, Michael agreed to recognize papal supremacy in exchange for Western support against Charles of Anjou. This decision provoked outrage in Constantinople. The population and clergy rejected union with Rome, which they saw as betrayal of Orthodox faith. The theological differences between Eastern and Western Christianity, the filioque clause, the use of unleavened bread, clerical celibacy, and above all papal supremacy, were not mere technicalities, but fundamental issues of doctrine and identity. Michael VIII could impose union by imperial decree, but he could not make his people accept it. The proposed union remained a dead letter, honored in diplomatic correspondence with Rome, but rejected in practice by the Byzantine Church and people. Michael's diplomatic machinations succeeded in preventing Charles of Anjou's invasion. In 1282 AD, a rebellion in Sicily, the Sicilian Vespers, destroyed Charles's power and saved Constantinople. Byzantine gold had helped finance the rebellion. It was a triumph of Byzantine diplomacy, proof that the empire could still defend itself through cunning when military strength failed. But it was also evidence of how far Byzantium had fallen, reduced to financing rebellions and playing off Western powers against each other, no longer able to confront enemies directly. The 14th century brought accelerating decline. The empire faced threats it could not overcome. In Anatolia, Turkish beyliks, small emirates, expanded at Byzantine expense. One of these, led by a chieftain named Osman, would eventually give its name to the Ottoman Empire. These Turkish states were not yet unified, but they pressed constantly on Byzantine borders, raiding, conquering, settling Christian lands with Muslim populations. In the Balkans, the Serbian Empire under Stefan Dusan expanded aggressively, conquering Byzantine territory in Macedonia and Greece. The Bulgarians remained hostile. The empire's Balkan possessions fragmented into semi-independent despotates. And within the empire itself, civil wars became endemic. The Palaeologos dynasty tore itself apart in succession disputes that invited foreign intervention and devastated what little remained of Byzantine power. The civil war between Andronikos Roman II and his grandson Andronikos III, lasting from 1321 to 1328 AD, was followed by an even more destructive conflict between John V. Palaeologos and John VI. Cantacuzenios from 1341 to 1347 AD. Both sides hired foreign mercenaries, Serbs, Turks, Catalans, who ravaged Byzantine territory. Both sides offered Byzantine fortresses and cities to foreign powers in exchange for military support. The empire was cannibalizing itself, trading territory for temporary advantage in dynastic disputes. The Ottoman Turks, still a relatively small beylik in northwestern Anatolia, exploited Byzantine weakness brilliantly. Sultan Orhan allied with John VI Cantacuzeninos, providing troops that helped him win the civil war. As payment, Orhan married Cantacuzeninos' daughter Theodora. More significantly, the Ottomans established their first foothold in Europe when Cantacuzenos allowed them to use the fortress of Tzimp on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Once established in Europe, the Ottomans never left. In 1354 AD, an earthquake devastated the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Ottomans immediately occupied the ruined fortresses, establishing a permanent base in Europe. From here, they expanded into Thrace and the Balkans with remarkable speed. Byzantine appeals for their withdrawal were ignored. The empire was powerless to expel them. Within a generation, the Ottomans had conquered most of Thrace and extended deep into the Balkans, bypassing Constantinople to strike at Serbia, Bulgaria, and beyond. Sultan Murad I, who reigned from 1362 to 1389 AD, transformed the Ottomans from a frontier beylik into a major power. He moved the Ottoman capital to Adrianople Edirne in Thrace, just 150 miles from Constantinople. Byzantine territory was reduced to Constantinople itself, the city of Thessaloniki, the despotate of Mora in southern Greece, and a few scattered islands and fortresses. The empire existed in name only, a client state of the Ottoman Sultanate, paying tribute to survive. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 AD marked the end of Serbian independence and confirmed Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. The Byzantines, once masters of the Balkans, could only watch as Slavic kingdoms that had themselves fought against Byzantine power were now conquered by the Ottomans. There was bitter irony in the situation. The Orthodox Slavs looked to Constantinople as their spiritual mother, the source of their faith and culture. Now that mother was helpless to aid them. Emperor Manuel, the second Palaeologos, who reigned from 1391 to 1425 AD, spent much of his time traveling through Western Europe, begging for military assistance. He visited Venice, Paris, and London, pleading with kings and popes for a crusade to save Constantinople. He cut a pathetic figure, an emperor without an empire, dressed in Byzantine imperial purple, wearing the crown of Constantine, ruling a city surrounded by Ottoman territory. Western courts received him with courtesy and sympathy. They gave him nothing of substance. The West had neither the will nor the unity to mount a serious campaign against the Ottomans. In 1396 AD, a crusade was attempted. King Sigismund of Hungary led a large army of Hungarian, French, German, and other Western knights against the Ottomans. At Nicopolis, Sultan Bayezid I annihilated the Crusader army. It was the last major Western crusade against the Ottomans for half a century. The defeat confirmed that Byzantium could expect no salvation from the West. Salvation came instead from an unexpected quarter, the East. In 1402 AD, the great Central Asian conqueror Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, invaded Anatolia at the head of a massive Mongol army. At the Battle of Ankara, Timur destroyed the Ottoman army and captured Sultan Bayezid I himself. The Ottoman Empire collapsed into civil war as Bayezid's sons fought for succession. Anatolia descended into chaos. For Byzantium, this was a reprieve, a stay of execution. The empire gained another half-century of existence, but it was only a reprieve, nothing more. The Byzantines lacked the strength to exploit Ottoman weakness. They could not reconquer lost territories or rebuild their shattered economy. Constantinople survived, but it did not recover. The city's population continued to decline. Districts within the walls were abandoned, reverting to fields and orchards. Travelers described a city of magnificent ruins inhabited by a few thousand people, a living monument to vanished greatness. The Ottomans recovered from Timur's invasion. Mehmed and Murad II patiently rebuilt the Sultanate, reunifying Anatolia and the Balkans under Ottoman control. By the 1440s, the Ottomans were stronger than ever. Byzantine emperors continued to pay tribute, to send princes as hostages to the Ottoman court, to carefully navigate the dangerous currents of Ottoman politics. They had become vassals in all but name. In 1439 Emperor John VIII Palaeologos attended the Council of Florence, a last desperate attempt to secure Western military aid through church union with Rome. After lengthy theological debates, a declaration of union was signed. The Eastern bishops agreed to recognize papal supremacy and accept Western theological positions on disputed issues. In exchange, the West promised military support. John returned to Constantinople, believing he had saved the empire. But the union was rejected in Constantinople, just as it had been rejected in the 13th century. The Orthodox clergy and people refused to accept submission to Rome. Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara, many said, meaning it was preferable to fall to the Ottomans with their faith intact than to be saved through betrayal of orthodoxy. The sentiment revealed the depth of feeling. For Byzantines, their Orthodox Christian faith was inseparable from their identity. To abandon orthodoxy was to cease being Byzantine. The Union of Florence was celebrated only in a few churches. The promised Western military aid never materialized on any significant scale. The final act approached. Sultan Murad II died in 1451 AD, succeeded by his 19-year-old son, Mehmed II. The young sultan was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to accomplish what his predecessors had failed to achieve, the conquest of Constantinople. Mehmed was cultured and educated, interested in Greek philosophy and Roman history. He understood the symbolic importance of Constantinople. To rule from the city of Constantine would make him not merely a Turkish sultan, but the successor to Rome itself. Mehmed began preparations immediately. He constructed a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, Rumeli Hisari, just north of Constantinople, matching an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. These fortresses controlled the Bosphorus, cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea and any possible aid from Genos colonies or Orthodox Christian states to the north. Byzantine protests were ignored. Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologos, the last Byzantine emperor, could only watch as the noose tightened. Constantine XI was a tragic figure, a capable man in an impossible situation. He became emperor in 1449 AD, ruling an empire that consisted of little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered outposts. He knew what was coming. He spent his brief reign preparing the city's defenses, repairing the ancient walls, gathering what military forces he could muster, and pleading for Western aid. Some help came, a few hundred Italian soldiers, volunteers from Genoa and Venice, led by the Genos captain Giovanni Giustiniani, an expert in siege warfare. It was pitifully inadequate, but it was all Constantine received. On April 6, 1453 Mehmed II arrived before Constantinople with an army estimated at 80,000 to 100,000 men. He brought with him the latest military technology, massive cannons designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 600 pounds. These bombards were the most powerful artillery pieces in the world, though they were slow to reload and prone to explosion. Mehmed positioned them to target the weakest points in Constantinople's walls. Inside the city, Constantine could muster perhaps 7,000 defenders, including the Italian reinforcements. The population, swollen with refugees from Ottoman-occupied territories, numbered perhaps 50,000, but most were civilians unable to fight. The defenders had to spread themselves thinly along 14 miles of walls, the land walls facing west, and sea walls along the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. It was an impossible defensive challenge. The siege began with bombardment. Day after day, Mehmed's cannons pounded the Theodosian walls, the great triple fortifications that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. Massive sections of wall crumbled under the impacts. Each night, Byzantine defenders frantically repaired the breaches with timber, barrels filled with earth, anything they could find. By day, Ottoman infantry assaulted the damaged sections, only to be driven back by desperate defenders. Mehmed attempted to bring his fleet into the Golden Horn, the sheltered harbor on Constantinople's northern side, but the Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the entrance, preventing Ottoman ships from entering. So Mehmed ordered his ships hauled over land, a logistical feat that stunned the defenders. Over the course of a single night, Ottoman soldiers dragged ships up from the Bosphorus, across the hill behind Galata, and down into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain. Now Constantinople faced attacks from the north as well as the west. Inside the city, morale fluctuated between desperate hope and despair. Some believed God would save the city, that divine intervention would repeat the miracles of past sieges. Others saw the end approaching. Religious processions wound through the streets, carrying icons, chanting prayers. In Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic clergy held a joint service, a final reconciliation in the face of imminent catastrophe. Constantine XI participated, receiving communion alongside his people, a warrior emperor prepared to die defending his city. For nearly 2 months, the siege continued. Ottoman casualties mounted into the thousands. Mehmed's advisors urged him to withdraw, but the young sultan refused. He had staked his reputation on conquering Constantinople. To retreat would mean humiliation. He ordered preparations for a final, all-out assault. On the night of May 28, 1453 AD, Mehmed issued his orders. The next day would see a general assault, with all Ottoman forces attacking simultaneously. Inside Constantinople, Constantine addressed his defenders. He spoke of honor, of duty, of defending their faith and civilization. He reminded them they stood at the walls that had protected Christendom for 1,000 years. The speech was Constantine's last testament, preserved in accounts by those who heard it. Then he took his position on the walls, near the most vulnerable section, at the St. Romanus Gate. The final assault began before dawn on May 29, 1453 AD. Ottoman forces attacked in waves, irregular troops first, then provincial troops, finally the elite janissaries, the Sultan's household soldiers, drawn from Christian boys converted to Islam and trained as fanatical warriors. The bombardment intensified. Sections of wall collapsed. The defenders fought with savage desperation, knowing this was the end. At a critical moment, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genos commander, was wounded. He was carried from the walls to be taken to a ship for medical treatment. His withdrawal caused panic among the Italian defenders. At nearly the same moment, Ottoman forces discovered a small postern gate. The Kerkerporta had been left unlocked. A group of Janissaries forced their way through and climbed to the top of the walls, raising the Ottoman banner. The sight of Ottoman flags on the walls triggered collapse. Defenders fled toward the harbors, hoping to escape by ship. Constantine XI, seeing the walls lost, removed his imperial regalia and plunged into the fighting. The last Roman emperor died fighting in the streets, sword in hand, his body never identified among the thousands of dead. It was a death worthy of legend. The last Constantine dying in the defense of the city founded by the first Constantine, over 11 centuries earlier. Ottoman soldiers poured into Constantinople. What followed was predictable by the grim laws of medieval warfare. When a city refused to surrender and was taken by storm, the attackers were entitled to 3 days of plunder. The slaughter was immense. Thousands were killed in the streets. Churches were desecrated. Hagia Sophia, where civilians had taken refuge praying for divine deliverance, was broken into. The killing stopped only when Mehmed himself entered the city and ordered his troops to cease. The Sultan rode to Hagia Sophia and dismounted at its entrance. Inside, he found the great church stripped of its treasures by his soldiers. He reportedly struck a soldier who was breaking up the marble floor, ordering that buildings be preserved. Then he ordered the church converted into a mosque. The Christian images were plastered over. A mihrab was installed indicating the direction of Mecca. Within days, the call to prayer echoed from minarets that would be added to Hagia Sophia's exterior. Mehmed styled himself Caesar of Rome, Caesar I Rum. He had conquered the city that had been the heart of Christendom for over a millennium. He was now the master of Constantine's city, the possessor of a prize that had eluded every Muslim conqueror for 800 years. He immediately set about rebuilding Constantinople, now Istanbul, though the name change took centuries to complete, repopulating it with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, transforming it into the capital of a new empire that would eventually stretch from Algeria to Yemen, from Hungary to the Persian Gulf. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Venice and Genoa lost their privileged trading positions. The Pope called for a crusade that never materialized. Scholars and refugees fled westward, carrying Byzantine manuscripts and knowledge. These Greek scholars, settling in Italy, contributed to the flowering of the Renaissance, bringing with them the classical texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries. In a sense, Byzantium's intellectual legacy helped spark the rebirth of classical learning in Western Europe. But for the Orthodox Christian world, the fall of Constantinople was an apocalyptic catastrophe. The city of Constantine, the new Rome, the great Christian capital, had fallen to Islam. Prophecies circulated that the end times were approaching. The despotate of Mora in southern Greece, the last Byzantine territory on the mainland, fell to the Ottomans by 1460 AD. The Empire of Trebizond, isolated on the Black Sea coast, surrendered in 1461 AD. With its fall, the last organized Byzantine state ceased to exist. Yet Byzantine civilization did not entirely die. The Orthodox Church survived under Ottoman rule, maintaining its traditions, its liturgy, its theology. The Patriarch of Constantinople continued to lead the Orthodox faithful, now as a subject of the Ottoman Sultan rather than a colleague of the Christian emperor, but preserving the faith nonetheless. Orthodox Christianity remained the dominant religion throughout the Balkans and spread further into Eastern Europe and Russia. Russia, in particular, saw itself as Byzantium's heir. Moscow styled itself the Third Rome, after Rome itself had fallen to barbarians and Constantinople to the Turks. Moscow stood as the last bastion of true Orthodox Christianity. Ivan III of Moscow married Sophia Palaeologina, niece of Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor. Russian Tsars adopted Byzantine court ceremonies, the double-headed eagle of Byzantium, and the claim to be protectors of Orthodox Christianity. This ideology would influence Russian politics for centuries, down to the 20th century. The Byzantine legacy lived on in countless ways. The architectural influence of Byzantine churches can be seen throughout Eastern Europe and Russia in the onion domes and iconostasis screens that characterize Orthodox church architecture. Byzantine art, with its distinctive style of religious iconography, continued to develop and influence Christian art for centuries. Byzantine law, codified by Justinian, formed the basis for legal systems across Europe. Perhaps most significantly, Byzantine civilization had preserved classical Greek learning through the medieval period. While Western Europe struggled through the Dark Ages following Rome's fall, Byzantine scholars copied and studied the works of ancient Greek philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, and poets. Plato and Aristotle, Homer and Euclid, Ptolemy and Galen, all survived because Byzantine scribes laboriously copied their texts generation after generation. When these works reached Western Europe in the late Middle Ages, they revolutionized European thought, contributing to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The Byzantine achievement was extraordinary. From the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, they created a civilization that endured for over 1,000 years. They defended Christian Europe against Persian, Arab, and Turkish invasions, serving as a bulwark that absorbed attacks that might otherwise have overwhelmed the fragmented kingdoms of the West. They created a unique synthesis of Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith that left an indelible mark on world history. They were not Romans in the classical sense. They spoke Greek, not Latin, and their culture was deeply influenced by the Greek and Eastern traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean. But they saw themselves as Romans, as the direct continuation of the empire founded by Augustus. To them, there had been no fall of Rome in 476 AD, merely the loss of Western provinces to barbarians. The true Roman Empire continued in Constantinople, unbroken, until that final day in 1453 AD, when the walls were breached and the last emperor fell fighting in the streets. Byzantium's fall marked more than the end of an empire. It marked the end of a continuous link to the ancient world. For over 2 millennia, from the founding of Rome in the 8th century BC to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD, there had been a Roman state, however changed and transformed over the centuries. With Constantinople's fall, that link was severed. The medieval world gave way to the early modern era. The Mediterranean ceased to be a Christian sea and became contested territory between Christian and Muslim powers. The balance of power shifted. Europe turned westward, toward the Atlantic, and the voyages of discovery that would lead to European global dominance in subsequent centuries. In Orthodox Christian tradition, Constantinople's fall has never been truly accepted. For centuries, the Orthodox faithful prayed for the city's liberation, for the restoration of Christian rule to Hagia Sophia. Popular legends spoke of Constantine the 11th, the marble emperor, who had not died but had been spirited away by angels and would return one day to reclaim his city. These legends reflected the deep trauma of losing Constantinople, the sense that something irreplaceable had been destroyed. Modern historians view Byzantium more dispassionately, but with growing appreciation. For centuries, Western European scholars, influenced by Enlightenment prejudices and Protestant anti-Orthodox sentiment, dismissed Byzantium as a decadent, superstitious, and stagnant civilization, a degraded continuation of classical Rome. The very word Byzantine became an insult, implying excessive complexity, intrigue, and decadence. This view has been thoroughly revised. Modern scholarship recognizes Byzantium as a dynamic, sophisticated civilization that made crucial contributions to world history. Byzantine diplomacy was famously subtle, but this reflected the empire's geopolitical situation, surrounded by enemies, and forced to survive through cunning when military strength was insufficient. Byzantine theology may seem excessively focused on minute doctrinal distinctions, but these debates represented serious intellectual engagement with fundamental questions about the nature of divinity and humanity. Byzantine art may appear stylized and non-naturalistic compared to classical or Renaissance art, but it was achieving different aims, representing spiritual rather than physical reality. The Byzantine Empire endured longer than almost any other political entity in history. The 1,000-year span from Constantine's founding of Constantinople in 330 AD to its fall in 1453 AD encompasses more time than separates us today from the Middle Ages. Across that millennium, Byzantium weathered countless crises: Persian invasions, Arab conquests, Bulgarian wars, Crusades, Turkish expansion, internal rebellions, economic crises, plagues, and theological controversies. That it survived so long is testament to the resilience of Byzantine institutions, the devotion of Byzantine populations, and the strength of the Orthodox Christian faith that bound the empire together. If we seek to understand Byzantium's character, we might begin with the divine liturgy, the Orthodox church service that has remained essentially unchanged since Byzantine times. The liturgy is long, elaborate, filled with processions, incense, and chanting. Icons surround the worshippers. The priest disappears behind the iconostases, the screen that separates the altar from the congregation, performing the sacred mysteries. The congregation stands for hours. There are no pews in Orthodox churches. The experience is immersive, multi-sensory, designed to transport worshippers out of ordinary time and space into the heavenly realm. This liturgy reflects core Byzantine values: the emphasis on tradition and continuity, maintaining practices unchanged across centuries. The sense that the earthly church service is participating in a heavenly liturgy performed by angels. The use of beauty, icons, music, architecture, as a means of approaching the divine. The mystical understanding of faith, where spiritual truths cannot be fully expressed in words but must be experienced. The communal nature of worship, binding together all Orthodox Christians across time and space in a single church. These values shaped Byzantine civilization. The continuity with the ancient past, the sense of carrying forward Roman imperial traditions. The mystical and transcendent understanding of imperial authority, where the emperor was God's representative on earth, responsible for leading Christian souls to salvation. The emphasis on theological correctness, on maintaining true faith against heresies that threatened the empire's spiritual integrity. The aesthetic sophistication, visible in Byzantine art, architecture, and court ceremonies. Byzantium was never static or unchanging, despite later stereotypes. It evolved continuously, adapting to new challenges while maintaining core traditions. The 7th century empire of Heraclius was vastly different from the 4th century empire of Constantine, and the 14th century empire of the Palaeologan was different still. Language shifted from Latin to Greek. The administrative system was repeatedly reformed. Military organization evolved from Roman legions to the theme system to mercenary armies. Theological understanding developed through centuries of councils and controversies. Art styles changed across the centuries. Yet through all these changes, a fundamental Byzantine identity persisted, Roman in law and imperial ideology, Greek in language and culture, Orthodox Christian in faith. The empire's greatest strength was also its ultimate weakness, Constantinople itself. The city was virtually impregnable, protected by walls that stood for 1,000 years, supplied by sea, strategically positioned to control trade between Europe and Asia. This impregnability allowed the empire to survive disasters that would have destroyed states dependent on land territory. When Arabs conquered Syria and Egypt, Constantinople stood. When Turks overran Anatolia, Constantinople endured. As long as the capital stood, the empire existed, but this created a fatal dependency. The empire became increasingly identified with the city. As territories were lost, the empire contracted until it was little more than Constantinople and its suburbs. In the end, the empire and the city were identical. When Constantinople fell, the empire ceased to exist instantly and completely, unlike other empires that fragmented gradually, leaving successor states. There were no successor states to Byzantium except the Ottoman Empire itself, which claimed to be Rome's heir. The question of whether Byzantium was truly Roman remains debated. The Byzantines themselves never doubted it. They called themselves Romans, Rhameoi in Greek, until the end. Their empire was the Roman Empire, continuous and unbroken. They preserved Roman law, Roman administrative traditions, and the Roman claim to universal authority. That they spoke Greek rather than Latin was, to them, irrelevant. Greek had always been the dominant language in the eastern provinces, even under the classical Roman Empire. Western Europeans disagreed. To them, particularly after the papal coronation of Charlemagne in 800 AD, the true Roman Empire had been transferred to the Germanic West. The Byzantines were Greeks, not Romans, schismatics who had broken from the true Catholic Church, effeminate Orientals who had abandoned Roman virtue. This disagreement was never resolved and contributed to the Crusaders' willingness to attack Constantinople in 1204 AD. Modern historians generally accept that Byzantium was a continuation of the Roman Empire, though profoundly transformed by time, geography, and culture. The Byzantine Empire was to the classical Roman Empire what the later Roman Republic was to the early Republic, changed almost beyond recognition, yet maintaining essential continuities that justified claiming the same identity. Whether we call it the Byzantine Empire or the medieval Roman Empire is largely a matter of convenience. The Byzantines themselves knew what they were. They were the Romans, the last Romans, carrying forward a tradition from the ancient world, until the modern world was born. In the final analysis, Byzantium's greatest legacy may be simply this: it kept alive the flame of classical civilization through 1,000 years, when that flame might otherwise have been extinguished. In preserving Greek philosophy and Roman law, in maintaining literacy and learning, in creating magnificent works of art and architecture, in holding back waves of invaders who might have overrun Europe, Byzantium performed an invaluable service to human civilization. When those walls finally fell on May 29, 1453 AD, when the last emperor died fighting in the streets, when Hagia Sophia echoed with Muslim prayers for the first time, an era truly ended. The medieval world gave way to modernity. The last living connection to Rome was severed. But the Byzantine achievement, the preservation and transmission of classical culture, the development of Orthodox Christianity, the creation of a unique civilization that synthesized East and West, endures to this day, influencing cultures from Russia to the Mediterranean, leaving an indelible mark on world history. The Byzantine Empire was Rome's longest shadow, stretching across a millennium, gradually fading but never quite disappearing until that final spring day when Ottoman banners flew from the walls of Constantinople. The city survived as Istanbul, greater and more populous than ever, capital of a new empire. But something irreplaceable was lost. The last echo of ancient Rome had fallen silent. The 1,000-year empire was no more.